Imagine a hormone that helps you burn belly fat, build muscle, improves your skin quality, and on top of that makes you feel as energetic as a 20-year-old guy. That's what growth hormone seems to promise, and that's how many anti-aging clinics sell it. However, be careful because if misunderstood and especially if misused, this hormone also has many risks that you should be aware of. However, optimizing it through habits is really taking your health to the next level, and I recommend everyone to do it. That's what you're going to learn today, and for that, well, who better than Dr. Miguel Martinez del Campo, a medical expert in hormones with extensive training and experience in the field of longevity, who is joining us today. How are you, Miguel?
Very well, thank you very much, Dr. Borja Bandera.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I know that yesterday you gave a 5-hour course, no less, on hormones, right?
Yes, very interesting. Preventive hormonology, as you know, is one of the causes of premature aging, and it's always good to get everything to optimal levels.
There's a lot of talk about sex hormones, but little is said about the hormone we'll discuss today. It's like something of a mystery to me, also very complex, but that's why we want to draw on your expertise. What is GH and what are its functions?
Well, the growth hormone, also called GH or HGH, which stands for human growth hormone in English, is a hormone produced in the anterior pituitary gland, which is like a little light bulb we have in the brain that releases hormones. It is released in response to another hormone from the hypothalamus, which is a bit higher up, called GHRH, that is growth hormone releasing hormone. And what this hormone does, it has many functions, is to stimulate the production of another hormone in the liver, which is also called IGF-1 or somatomedin C. These are hormones, let's say sisters or cousins, that have similar functions, but they are not the same. And they affect many parts of the body: the brain, muscles, skin, as you mentioned, sexual function, cognition, and the arteries. These are similar functions, very complex and multifunctional, let's say.
For example, in bone and muscle, they help build, right? Are they anabolic?
They are anabolic. I mean, they increase muscle mass, they burn fat.
It's nearly the only hormone that does both, right?
It's comparable to androgens, to testosterone as well, right? They're similar, but the thing is they have different functions.
And there are pathologies that cause an excess of GH.
As you know, acromegaly is one of the pathologies that produces an excess of this hormone, which also leads to problems.
We will talk later about those problems, also about the problems caused by deficiency, which is also an important pathology. And how does the GH profile change throughout life? I mean, does somatopause really exist?
Yes, somatopause is real. It's a reality and it doesn't have a specific age, let's say. We know that we have high physiological levels of growth hormone because it's a hormone that makes us grow. But during the growth years, between 13 and 17, 18, 20 years old, and those levels, more or less, if we look at blood levels, we use IGF-1 to measure growth hormone because it's simpler. To calibrate, those physiological levels, in most of us who have had them normally, have been between 700 and 900 picograms per milliliter. We stop growing, and when we're around 20 to 25 years old, these drop to levels, depending on whether you're male or female, but between about 250 and 350 picograms per milliliter. The problem is when you go below those levels, symptoms start to appear. Signs of deficiency that can lead to disease.
And you get something like a subclinical GH deficiency. That is, in adults, a subclinical GH deficiency, which isn't very apparent, but when we measure it, IGF-1 is low.
Let's say that from the age of 30, and for many people even earlier and some later, we are subclinically deficient in growth hormone.
Well, I understand that has its good and bad sides, because it's true that when we study the biology of GH, it's true that animals with less GH are the ones that live the longest. In fact, when we do a GH receptor knockout in mice, their lifespan increases by almost 40%, and they also have less cancer and diabetes. So how do we understand this? On one hand, it's a hormone that helps us grow and promotes a good body composition. and it surely has more functions in the brain and so on. But on the other hand, if we have too much GH, there's more cancer, more diabetes, and a shorter life expectancy. Where does this balance lie? And most importantly, why?
This is like everything in life. If we eat too much, it's bad for us. Even if we eat very well, too much food kills us, and so does too little. So it's like everything in life. It's the same with exercise. Too much exercise kills us or makes us sick, and too little does too. Everything is about moderation. It's a balance. It's the equilibrium of life, let's say.
And we know, it's IGF-1 that stays steady throughout life. Do we know the optimal ranges for adults over the course of life?
Yes, we know them. We know that there's a significant drop after the age of 30, but it's very variable. I have patients in their 20s with levels like those of an 80-year-old, but it's a gradual decline. IGF-1 is, let's say, the way to measure growth hormone. Growth hormone is hard to measure. Why? Because production really happens while you're sleeping.
Of course. And of course, I'm wondering whether that IGF-1 also responds to bad habits in the end. And if people with bad habits have less IGF-1 than they should at 30, 40, 50, or 60 years old.
Obviously. Excess stress, overeating carbohydrates, lack of exercise, bad habits, not sleeping. These factors will lower growth hormone production.
We'll look into this further since it's a fascinating topic. I was mentioning before starting the talk about Laron syndrome. In a population in Ecuador, there is a genetic mutation that means there is no GH receptor. And in that population, who are people of very short stature, the rates of cancer and diabetes are almost zero, even when there are risk factors like obesity. But of course, they lack that height and probably other elements as well that we get. In the end, biology is a balance. As you say, too much or too little is bad. So let's try to help the audience naturally optimize their GH production. When and how is GH produced?
There are mainly two ways it's produced. First, with sleep, during the first hours of sleep, about 80% of growth hormone production happens, and then with physical exercise, it's about 20%. Although GH production is not constant, it happens in bursts.
That is, a lot is produced, then nothing. A lot, then nothing. 70 to 80% in the first hours of sleep. This means, for example, that if we go out partying, have several drinks, and get home at 4 in the morning, do you produce less GH? Yes.
Less is produced, especially when drinking alcohol, since it inhibits growth hormone production.
So, on a day of partying and drinking, you don't produce any GH?
You produce very little. You produce very little, yes.
Very interesting. Okay, and I also understand that it's not produced in just any phase of sleep, but during slow wave sleep, right?
Deep sleep?
Yes, which is deep sleep. So anything that harms deep sleep harms GH production. Correct. And it also affects the repair mechanisms of GH, because we haven't mentioned it, but it also helps with repair, right? Repairing tissue.
GH, along with melatonin, are the restorative hormones. So when we go to sleep, what is our body telling us? You need to repair. You need to repair everything. The mind, the body, the cells that have become a little sick. And if we don't sleep well deeply, we don't repair.
Therefore, alcohol also, certain medications, right? Like benzodiazepines or pharmaceuticals, what they do is cause lighter sleep. They sedate you, but almost wipes out deep sleep architecture, right? Is that true?
It's true, completely true. Benzodiazepines can make you fall asleep, induce sleep, but it's not quality sleep. It's not quality sleep.
OSA, right? Obstructive sleep apnea syndrome or obesity also greatly affects that deep sleep. And you say the other part, right? The other pillar is exercise. Does any type of exercise increase GH?
Especially strength training. But yes, exercise increases GH, but especially strength training.
There's an interesting fact. Lactate is produced during high-intensity exercise, including strength training, especially if you really push yourself. Until recently, it was actually looked down upon, but it's a signaling molecule that also stimulates GH at the pituitary level. So deep sleep, high-intensity exercise, more GH, more repair. And regarding nutrition, what we eat, because there's a lot of talk about whether intermittent fasting increases GH, what's the deal with that? Yes.
Intermittent fasting and fasting increase GH, so it's important to eat less, but eat high-quality food. And eating at the right time is also important. Intermittent fasting and then the type of food you eat. Very heavy meals with too many complex carbohydrates will inhibit GH. So,
Are you talking about complex carbohydrates or sugar? Well,
complex carbohydrates, we're talking about, when we talk about this, are carbohydrates with a high glycemic index and load, which means most cereals, most tubers, and obviously sugar.
that is, refined carbohydrates and sugar are simple, they inhibit the peak. Exactly. Especially if consumed close to bedtime, obviously. Okay, another good practical tip is not to stuff ourselves with sugar before going to sleep.
Don't eat a heavy meal before bed. Of course,
Of course. And then, with more visceral fat, right? It also seems that there are fewer GH pulses.
yes, of course, obesity means less GH.
All right, well, I think there are quite a few practical tips there, but let's look at the risks of excessive GH. What adverse effects could it cause?
Well, the typical disease caused by excess GH, as you know, is acromegaly. What is acromegaly? Well, you start to grow. GH is a hormone that makes both muscles and bones grow, and the distal parts start to grow. The hands get bigger, the nose, the forehead, the chin, the jaw, even the feet can get bigger. And not only that, you can also increase in size, in height.
There was also a higher risk of, if I recall correctly, carpal tunnel syndrome
Carpal tunnel syndrome, obviously, exactly.
due to the growth of soft tissue.
Exactly. And we know that in acromegalics, there is a higher rate of cancer, especially colon cancer, also thyroid cancer. And lately, it has also been more closely linked to an increased risk of gastric cancer, breast cancer, and urinary tract cancer.
Of course, it's like pouring gasoline on cells that are in the early stages of becoming cancerous. And a tumor that maybe was subclinical or wasn't going to progress to a clinical tumor or was in those very early stages can turn into a tumor and become apparent. So GH is not something to play around with. It also causes insulin resistance and diabetes, right? Correct.
Of course, yes, one of the side effects is that it increases the risk of diabetes. In fact, there are many patients who, one of the things we have to monitor in patients when we use GH is blood sugar levels, right?
But of course, we've talked about all the bad things, but we should also have good things to say about GH. When we have a deficiency, people quickly associate short stature in children with GH deficiency. There's been a lot of talk about the Messi myth, which I don't know if it's a myth or reality, that he had to be given GH so he could grow and so on. I don't know. But beyond height, what does GH provide us when it's at good levels?
Well, first, it's a restorative hormone. The first thing you'll notice is more restorative sleep. You'll wake up in the morning feeling completely rested. After exercise, it's a restorative hormone. You'll be able to work out and recover better after exercising. It's a fat-burning hormone. You'll reduce body fat. Your muscle mass will increase. You'll gain muscle mass, and your muscles will be more defined. Not only that, it's important for sexuality. It's very important for sexuality, both in men and women. It increases the quality of erections in men, the frequency of erections, and in women, it also improves orgasm and orgasm intensity. But it has many other functions. It has cognitive functions. It's also important for memory, for cognition, for social relationships. It's very important for many things.
Very interesting, very interesting. And now, moving on to more controversial, polemic, or inappropriate uses of GH. One comes to mind that's very clear, which is doping, which is used a lot in the world of bodybuilding or other sports, with, I imagine, an anabolic purpose.
Of course, it's an anabolic hormone. It's prohibited when used exogenously, as you know, in most competitions, both Olympic and professional. Yes, in the world of doping, growth hormone should be given if there's a deficiency. It shouldn't be given if there aren't optimal levels, but it shouldn't be given to become Superman.
Of course, that's a very good point. And what about in the field of longevity? We already know that in the end, it's also used, sometimes in a way that I think is incorrect, at least without evidence, in the field of anti-aging and longevity. But what evidence is there in humans, if you've looked into this topic?
There is very little evidence regarding longevity. In fact, there are no studies on longevity with growth hormone. What I can tell you is, I don't know if we'll live longer by taking growth hormone or not, at optimal health levels, but what I can say for sure is that we'll live better.
It's a bit like what happens with androgens, right? Testosterone hasn't really been shown to prolong life, but it does improve quality of life, right? Without a doubt. They're hormones that improve function, that improve body composition, but I always come back to that idea, that you can't have it all in biology. And that if we want many years of life, sometimes we have to sacrifice quality, or if we want to maximize and fully enjoy a high quality of life, sometimes we have to sacrifice years of life. I don't know if it's really more of a belief than a reality, but sometimes biology seems to tell us that, right? Like, if you take androgens, you can have a good quality of life, a lot of muscle mass, a high libido, but be careful, right? Because in the end, it's an anabolic stimulus, and it's kind of the same with GH. I don't know if you think the same.
I totally agree with what you're saying. Nature, keep in mind that it gives us these hormones not to be Superman, nor to be men or women, but to enjoy the functions of life. And that's what we have to do. We have to respect nature, and if we go beyond that, well, it's going to punish us.
Great reflection. Any message you'd like to leave us with in advance of your talk tomorrow about GH? Anything for the audience, even though they'll see it much later, right?
Well, I don't know. I think what we need to do is to debunk the idea that GH is a bad hormone. It's not a bad hormone. We all produce it naturally. We've produced it at very high levels when we were growing up. We don't need those levels now that we've grown up, but we do need to have optimal levels to maintain optimal and lasting health. Well,
very good. You've shared several key points, but if you'd like to give a final message to the audience, they'll see us. Well, before that, I want to remind the audience that we are doing this episode in collaboration with SEMAL, which is the Spanish Society of Anti-Aging and Longevity Medicine. And if you are a healthcare professional, a doctor, or any other health professional, and you're interested in the field of longevity, I recommend that you become a member of SEMAL, because that will allow you to stay up to date in this field, and it will let you collaborate with top-level professionals from all over the world in longevity, and really it will make you someone who is up to date and continuously learning in the field of longevity. And now, Miguel, I would say, if you want to give a final message to that camera, a recommendation, whatever you want, keep in mind that we will be seen in more than 40 countries and by many, many thousands of people. So look.
Growth hormone is your friend, but you shouldn't take it irresponsibly. You shouldn't listen to a lot of friends who tell us, or to market vendors or neighbors who say, no, this is very good or it's very bad. You have to put yourself in the hands of an expert who knows what they're doing, and follow the expert's instructions.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Miguel, for this talk about the growth hormone. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Better Than Yesterday. See you in the next one. Big hugs, and keep empowering yourselves. Bye.